Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Ayin Tet. We're going to start at the very bottom of Ayin Chet Amud Bet. This is the daf for Shabbat. Tanu Rabbanit, ganav v'natan la'acher v'tavach. Somebody steals and then gives it to somebody else to slaughter. We talked about this before. It's the topic for the beginning of today about having somebody else do your work for you. Normally we say ein shliach lidvar avera. There is no such thing as agency for doing a sin. You send someone to do a sin, well, it's their problem, not yours. But in this case, we say the reverse. Yesh shaliach lidvar avera. In fact, the topic of Din and Daf this week of Alana Stein-Hain is specifically on this issue. Very fascinating issue, so recommended listening. Ganav v'natan la'acher u'machal. Somebody steals and then gives it to somebody else to sell. Same idea. Or ganav v'ikdish, if you steal and then sanctify the item. Or ganav v'hikif, or you steal and then you give it to someone instead of, you sell it to someone, but on credit. They don't give you the money right away. Ganav v'ichlif, or you did a barter. There was no money transferred, but you did give them the item. It was kind of sale, but a sale where you don't actually get money, but you get a bartered item. Ganav v'natan b'matana, you give a gift to somebody, so you didn't sell it, but you gave it to somebody else. Again, all of these, including the hekdesh, which you'll remember, is about transferring ownership. If this sugya actually seems to disagree, this bright test seems to disagree with what we saw in Daf Ayin Bava. We'll get there very soon. Ganav upara chovo, you stole the item and then you used it to pay back a loan. Ganav upara be'kefo, you paid a credit you owed to somebody. Ganav shalach sivlonot bebeit chamiv, you used it after you stole it. You used it as gifts for your in-laws. Mishalem tashlu, this was a particular type of gift they would give when they got married. Mishalem tashlu ba'ava chamisha. All of these things were basically you're stealing something and then you're transferring ownership to somebody else. That is like selling. So which the Gemara says, my Kamma, what's this brighter teaching us? Well, Ashmi'inam Reisha ganav v'natam acher v'tavach to yesh shalech lidvar avera. In the first part, it's teaching us the first two cases that there is agency for doing a sin in this type of case. So afagav de b'chola Torah kula ein shalech lidvar avera, even though in all the Torah there is no such thing, you ask someone to do a sin and they do it, they get punished. In this case, there is agency, meaning that it's as if you slaughtered the animal yourself and you're liable to 4 or 5 payment. My timer, what's the reason? Utfacho umecharo. Ma michara de lo afshar de lava yidei acher, af tvicha al yidei acher mechayev. Okay, what do we see here? Just like because tfacho mecharo appear next to each other in the pasuk, we learn that what's true for selling, which is it takes 2 to sell. You can't sell by yourself. Likewise, even slaughtering can be done with someone else's help. Meaning, if you ask someone to do it, it's not exactly a total equal comparison here. But from there, we learn you can have it with somebody else. And then if somebody else does it for you, that's as if you're doing it. That we can obligate you for doing it, even though you're not the only one. This is also like if I need you to slaughter it, because let's say I don't know how to slaughter, so I'm liable, just like I can't sell without having another person there. I try to sell it to you and you won't buy it, well, then there's no sale. So same thing with the slaughtering. Again, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar enough. Bashmin and Seifa, and the next part, which is really not the last part, but the next line about ganav v'ikdish is teaching you mali mecharo lehedyot, mali mecharo l'shamayim. That we learned already, and this we kind of suggested before, but said it went against our Mishna, and we had a whole question about it, because our Mishna didn't seem to say this, because our Mishna seemed to say the hikdish part is actually not considered selling because you're actually not liable for arba b'chamisha. But this Braita says, ganav v'ikdish, you're liable for arba b'chamisha for the 4 or 5 payment because you're basically transferring ownership to God. What's the difference if you're selling to a human being or you're transferring ownership to God or to the temple? It's basically considered selling. So either this Braita contradicts that sugya, or some people try to explain it in different ways. There's different ways to resolve it, but we'll leave it as a bit of a question. Mishna, ganav b'reshut ha'ba'alim. We're now moving on to how you steal something and when you steal something, you basically, in order to be liable for stealing, you have to have somewhat acquired ownership, which happens in particular ways, similar to what we learned in Kiddushin about all different types of kinyanim, how we acquire items. So ganav b'reshut ha'ba'alim v'tavach u'machal chutz mireshutam. If you stole in the domain of the owner, and you slaughtered it and sold it outside the domain. So part of it was done in their property. Okay, if I steal something in someone's property, I haven't yet stolen it really until I take it out of their house. So if I did it, I had it in their house, but then I slaughtered it outside their house. In other words, when I stole it in their house. But then when I slaughtered it after, it was already outside their domain. Or I saw them on the street and I took some item from them. So then it immediately goes into my possession. And then tavachu macharber shutam, but I happen to then bring it back into their property and slaughter it there. Why I would do that, I have no idea. But let's say I did. Or if I did the whole thing, I stole it outside their domain and I slaughtered it or sold it outside their domain. In all these cases, because there was at one point where I had it outside their domain. One of the actions happened outside. But if all three things happened while they were still in their domain, patur, then I'll be exempt. But if I pulled it and left their domain, but I was on the way, I was pulling it. Now, Mashiach is usually a kinyan, but not if I'm in the owner's property. And that's what we're going to say right now. If I was pulling it while I was in the owner's property and and it died in their domain, patur. Well, then I'm actually exempt because I didn't really steal it yet because I never took it out of their domain. However, higbiho, but if I lift it, now lifting, even in someone else's domain, can be considered acquiring. So if I lift it in the domain of the owner, or hotziomi or shura ba'alim, or I took it out of their domain, vimit, and then the animal died, then chayav, I'm liable for having stolen it. There's a bunch of different interpretations of this, but we'll stick with Rashi's second interpretation, which many people prefer, which is if I gave this, let's say, okay, the case is where I owe money for a pidyon haben to a Kohen, and I say to the Kohen, listen, I have stuff in so-and-so's house, go into their house and take it. Now, I don't really, and I'm basically asking them to steal it. They don't know that necessarily. So I gave it to them from someone else's domain, okay, for the Bechor to redeem my firstborn son, or I owed someone money and I said, go take it from whatever is in so-and-so's house, or I gave it to one of the 4 shomrim and I said, can you watch this for me or rent it for me? But I gave them something from someone else's domain and they go into someone's domain to get it. We assume right now this means, and the shomer, or whoever I gave it to, the Baal Chov or the Kohen, pulls it, and the animal dies. If it's b'reshut haba'alim patur, if they pull it, but it was in the domain of the original owner, then I'm exempt for I didn't steal it. But higbiho, again, as in the previous case, if I lifted it up, oshotziom reshut haba'alim v'med chayav. Or I took it out of it, right? If I lifted it, not me, the person I told to lift it in their domain, or they took it out of the domain and then the animal died, then I'm liable for stealing. So by a Maimar asked a totally different question and asked, when it comes to a shomer, if I ask you to watch my item, from what moment do you take on responsibility? From the moment you consented to watch my item, or from the moment that you did an act of acquiring, mashicha, let's say, you pulled the object. If you pull the object, then you're responsible. But if not, just because you said, sure, I'll watch your item, maybe it doesn't mean you're responsible yet until you actually do an act of acquiring. So Amar of Yemar, Tashma, Rav Yemar says, I can prove it from our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? So what do you see here? If they were pulling it, right, they're going to be exempt if they pulled it in the domain of the thief. What do you see here? That what's important, it needs to be pulled. The pulling actually affects a kinyan. Otherwise, it's not as if they took it to watch, which means I'm not responsible for the theft. Until they actually assume ownership of watching this item, I'm not going to be considered a thief. So what do you see here? My love shomer, is it not talking about the shomer pulling the item? Ushma minat tiknu mashicha b'shomrim. What do you see here? There is mashicha for shomrim, right? The mashicha is a proper kinyan that you're not going to be chayam until you pull it. So now they say, Amalei lo ganav. Now they suggest maybe I understand the Mishnah differently. Maybe it's the ganav who was pulling it. So in other words, now it's a little bit hard to read this, but what would you say? If let's say, okay, nitanola b'chorot b'no l'bal chov. Let's say it wasn't me who is the thief, but let's take Naomi. Naomi gave something to a Kohen, okay, something of her own to a Kohen, and then I stole it from the other person, or she gave it to a creditor. Now it would be weird to explain the Mishna this way, and in fact, they're going to reject this explanation. Or Naomi gave it to a shomer. This maybe has a little bit more, because if Naomi gave it to a shomer and then I stole it, well, maybe it's not considered stealing it from their house. The other cases that would seem the ownership would already change ownership to the other person. It would be weird that if Naomi gave it to Yael, let's say, then what, I wouldn't be liable if I stole it from her? If let's say Yael's husband was a Kohen and she gave it to the Kohen, of course I'd be responsible. It's now the Kohens. So it's a little bit weird to think this, but maybe with the shomer, it makes sense that when it comes to the shomer case, if Naomi gave it to Yael to watch, and then Ruth came and stole it from Yael, then, maybe you would think, well, it was taken from the house of the shomer. And that would be, maybe you wouldn't be liable. And that's what they're trying to say. No. When is the ganav responsible? The ganav is responsible when they pull it out of the house of the shomer. And then that would what it would be teaching them. To which they say, but hatana l'reisha, what's the difference? And it makes no difference. If you're saying the ganav is the one who pulled it or lifted it, well, we already learned that in the first part of the Mishnah where it said a regular case of theft. So it'd be weird to be saying, okay, and also if you steal it from the creditor or you steal it from, right, that really is unnecessary. And even from a shomer, it seems unnecessary. To which they say, no, tana ganav shaganav mi beta balim, but tana ganav shaganav mi beta shomer. No, maybe there is a reason. Because maybe you would think there's a difference between stealing it from the guardian's house or stealing it from the owner's house themselves. So Amalei Rav Ashi lo titchie. Mali ganav shaganav mi beta shomer, mali ganav shaganav mi beta balim. He says, I don't know what you're talking about. There should be absolutely no difference between the thief who steals from a shomer's house and the thief who steals from the owner's house. Either which way, while the shomer is watching it, they're basically like the owner. So that's a ridiculous havamina, in which case we go back to saying, like Rav Yemer, elalav shomer, it must be the shomer doing the pulling, in which case, shmamina tiknu mashicha b'shomrim shmamina. Therefore, we can infer from here, there is mashicha by shomer. Itmar nami, it was also said, Amar Rabbi Elazar, kederech shetiknu mashicha b'lekuchot, and in fact, Rabbi Elazar says the same thing. Just like there's mashicha by selling, there's also mashicha for shomrim. Okay, it is an effective, without mashicha, it's not a kinyan. Just like without mashicha in a sale, it's not an effective sale. Tanya nami hachi, here's a bright that proves Rabbi Elazar the Amora. Okay, just like you have it by a sale, you have it also in shomrim. Now they're adding another line, which is just the second line of that bright, had nothing to do with our topic. But just like land is acquired with kesef, shtar, and chazakah, those are three ways you can acquire land. The same way that you rent things. Now, the Gemara just asked a question, which is a little weird why they even thought this was a question, but what kind of rental are we talking about? I'm moving now to Amabet. If you want to say schirut metaltalin, rental of movable property, there's no such thing as a shtar affecting an act of acquiring for movable property, right? You have mashicha, you have hagbaha, lifting, right? Mashicha pulling, mesira passing over, but you don't have documents. That doesn't work for movables. So amar of chistis chirut karka. Obviously, we're talking about rental of land. So the same way that land is acquired in those three ways, also rental of land. A rental contract, let's say, is acquired in those ways. A rental of, a house or something. Amar Rabbi Elazar, another halacha about theft. Ra'uhu shehitmim b'charashim. Okay, if they saw that he was hiding in a forest, v'tavach umachal. So then, in other words, he hid. 1 second. Right. Someone was hiding in a forest in order to steal animals. Okay, the shepherds would come through the forest and he would basically steal the animals when he saw them. And what happens here? Then tavachu machal. Now it seems like he didn't pull the animal or anything else. On the spot, just sold it or slaughtered it. Mishalem tashlumei arba'a v'chamisha. So you pay the 4 or 5 payment. To which the Gemara asks, we're going to have a few questions on this. First, Amai, halo mashach, but there was no mashicha. So on Rav Chisda, shehi kisha b'makel. It must be where he hit it with a stick and got it to move from the stick, and that's why there was a kinyan here. Okay, there was an acquiring, act of acquiring affected. If you remember, we learned in Kiddushin that this could be an act of acquiring when you hit it with a stick and it moves on account of you. You basically prodded it to move. That would count as an act of acquiring. So while you didn't do anything active, you did sort of because you hit it with a stick, but you didn't actually pull it. Still, you acquired it. Amre, but another question. V'kevan shera'uhu gazlanu. But don't we assume that the shepherds saw him? And if the shepherds saw him, then it's not in secret. Ganeva is usually in secret, and ganeva has the 4 or 5 payment. But gazela, which is usually when armed robbery, or it doesn't even have to be armed. It could just be where you see the thief in front of you, and they're not scared of you at all. Well, here it sounds like he's more of a gazlan because he did it out in the open. It was in a forest. To which they say, "What do you mean?" But he was hiding in the forest. Because he was hiding, we treat this more like geneva, and that's why it had the 4 or 5 payment. To which the Gemara asked them, well, ela gazlan hechidami. So what exactly is the case of a gazlan? We're going to bring 2 different rabbis who bring 2 different psukim from the Torah, which all mention the word gazal, the shorish, the root gazal. And we're going to say this is a prime example. But there are 2 different examples, and then we're going to say, why doesn't one hold like the other? Amar Rabbi Aval. Kigon B'nai ben Yehoyada was listed as one of the strong men that David had, these very strong giborim, his strong men, and it describes in Shmuel Bet chapter 23 different things about different ones. So here's one of them. Kigon B'nai ben Yehoyada, Shenema vayigzol et hachanit miyad hamitzri v'yargeu b'chanito. He stole the sword from the Egyptian, obviously pulled it out from him, and then killed him. So what do you see? That's what stealing is. You take something right in front of somebody's face, and that would be theft. That would be, again, gzela. But again, it's hard to define these in English. They're both theft, but gzela is open, out in the open theft. Rabbi Yochanan Amar kegon ba'alei Shechem. It's like the people of Shechem. This comes up in chapter 9 of Shoftim with Avimelech. Shene'amar vayasimu lo ba'alei Shechem ha'aravim al rashei ha'harim. They put up these ambushes. And then they stole anybody who would pass, right? They would ambush the people, come out and steal from them. Rabbi Aval, my time alone, my hand. Now, why did Rabbi Aval hold by the second one? To which they say, now notice again, both had the word vayigzol or vayigzelu, which is gzela. So why didn't he hold by the second one? So they answer, Amar lecha kevan demitmare et mure lo gazlanin, because they were hiding. They weren't considered gazlanim, because what's an ambush? It's where you hide. So because they were hidden, then even though in the end they came out, but they're not considered a gazlan, but a ganav. And that's why he didn't use that as his proof when he brought the other pasuk. For Rabbi Yochanan, so how's Rabbi Yochanan going to respond to the rejection of his opinion by saying, well, they were hiding? To which he says, wasn't that they were hiding because they were scared people were going to see them. They just didn't want people to see them and run away. They wanted people to be around. So they hid until they could come out, and then they jumped out and attacked the people. But the hiding wasn't for the purposes of, oh, we're scared people will see us. They weren't scared at all. They just didn't want people to know they were there so they wouldn't run away and they'd have nobody to steal from. Shalu Talmidav et Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And now we're going to finish to the next Mishna with some very basic questions about theft and about things we've been learning in our chapter, and kind of like the idea behind it all. Why was the Torah more strict with a ganav rather than a gazlan? What did the ganav do worse than a gazlan? Amar lahen, kavod eved l'chvod kono. The gazlan treated God and humans in the same way, meaning he wasn't scared of God, he wasn't scared of humans. He goes out, he does anything he wants out in the open. But the ganav lo nishva kavod eved l'kvod kono. But the eved, the ganav, didn't view these as one and the same. Why? Because what did he do? The ganav hides from people, but he knows, theoretically, right, that God sees everything. So if God sees everything, he can't hide from God. And basically, all he cares, and he does, now, neither of them care about God, but the ganav cares about people. He's scared of people, and he's not scared of God. It's much worse if you're scared of only people and not God. That's an insult to God. And we're going to see this more right now. כביכול, עשה עין שמעת כאילו אינה רואה, ואוזן שמעת כאילו אינה שומעת. Now, עין שמעת and אוזן שמעת is what we call לשון סגי נהור. It's where we say the opposite of what we really mean. He made the ayin shamata, which is God's eyes and God's ears, as if they didn't see, as if they didn't hear. Okay, and that means he basically, by hiding from humans, he's basically saying, no one can see me. And that means he doesn't believe that God can see him. And that's a smack in the face to God. Shene'emal, and here we're going to have some psukim in the prophets that basically talk about that. How bad people are if they don't fear God and then they think that God can't see them. Those who deepen from, or who go in the depths from God, I'm not sure exactly how to translate that word here, but listir etzah, to hide what they're trying to do. And they do their actions in the dark. And you have to read the end of that pasuk, which isn't in the Gemara. So who's going to see us and who's going to know? Meaning they obviously discount the fact that God will see them. And also it says, it says God won't see, and the God of Jacob won't be able to understand us. So that's a way of saying God has no understanding of anything, right? He doesn't see us. He doesn't know what's going on. They say because God left the land and God doesn't see. Okay, these are all psukim. Okay, the first was from Yeshayahu. The second was from Tehillim, about saying God doesn't see what's going on. Okay, I think, wait, there were three. Yeah, the third is from Yechezkel. Amar Rabbi Meir. Here's a braita. Rabbi Meir says, Mashallah mashal mishum Rabban Gamliel. So they said a certain mashal in the name of Rabban Gamliel. He said this mashal. Lema davar domeh. What is this like? The difference between a ganav and a gazlan. B'shnei b'nei adam shayu be'ir. It's like two people in the city, v'asu mishteh, and they made a party. Echad zimen et b'nei ha'ir v'lo zimen et b'nei ha'melech. One invited everybody in the city, but not the sons of the king. Ve'echad lo zimen et b'nei ha'ir v'lo zimen et b'nei ha'melech. And the other one just didn't invite anybody, really. They just invited a small group of people. They didn't invite the city, and they didn't invite the king's sons. Eze mehem on shomer rabah. Who did something much worse? The one who invited the people in the city, but didn't invite the king. It's a much bigger slap in the face. If you don't invite anybody, then it's not insulting to the people you didn't invite. So if you don't care about anybody, then, and you steal from anybody, and you don't think, you don't try to hide from anyone, you know everyone sees you and you just don't care. That's less bad than saying, let me try to hide from people so they won't see me. But basically saying, oh, but God's not going to see me anyway. Amar Rabbi Meir, bo re'eh kama gadol koach shemalacha. Another issue we're going to get now down to the bottom of, which is something we've been discussing without really getting to what's the reason for this, which is our parak starts out, our chapter starts out with this arba'a v'chamisha pim, 4 for a se and 5 for a shore, right? 4 for the smaller animals, 5 for the bigger animals. Now, why is that? So we're going to have two very different explanations. Amar Rabbi Meir, bo re'eh kama gadol koach shemalacha. Look how important it is, hard work, because shor shebitlomi melachto chamisha, sesha lo bitlomi melachto arba'a. What's the difference between a shor and a seh? A seh is used for shearing and for other things, but not, and for its milk, but it's not used for work. You don't plow with the sheep or anything, or goats. So a shor is a hardworking animal, and we use the big animals for all sorts of things. So this shows how the fact that we're going to punish you more for stealing a shore is because you're depriving someone of having this animal work for them. That shows how important hard work is. Amar Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he gives a different reason. Bo re'eh kama gadol kavod habriot. How important it is to respect the kavod habriot. Like, how would you explain that? The fact that I walk around and do things that make me look respectable, okay, as opposed to doing something that humiliates me in front of other people. So how important is that? Shor shalach b'raglav chamisha, seshir kifo aktefo arba'a. The shore, when I steal a shore, the shore walks on its own. So it's not embarrassing to walk around leading a shore, leading an ox. But a seh, a small animal, I have to carry on my shoulder. And that's a little humiliating for me to walk around carrying it on my shoulder. Because of that, we punish me less. I only have to pay 4. So if you notice the difference between the two, the first one is really an influence on how bad it is what I did to the one who I stole from. The second is more, how much can we diminish? We can cut off a little because I already got somewhat punished by carrying around the set, whereas I didn't with the shiur, and therefore I have to get the complete punishment. So the focus on one is more on the person who you steal from, and the focus on the other is more the person who stole. Okay, let's review before we get to the next Mishnah, because we're kind of done with most of the daf and this big section. So we started with transferring ownership in all sorts of ways. All of that comes under the general mechira term in the Torah. And then we also talked about yesh lech lidvar avera was one thing we learned from there, and making something sanctified is as if you're changing ownership. Then we moved to the whole thing about acquiring and how, when do you acquire a stolen item, and how at some point it has to be outside the domain of the owners. And then we talked about the cases where you even tell someone to steal from someone else's house and they do the ownership act. And then we had a whole thing, can we learn from here that there is Mashicha by Shomrim, which we in the end did prove. And then we went to hiding, and from there we got into, right, this case of someone was hiding, and then, or it was kind of a ruling about someone who was hiding and didn't actually move it, and then that was about acquiring, and then we said, he must have hit it with a stick, gotten it to move, otherwise it doesn't make sense that there was no act of acquiring. And then we had this case of, from there we got to, what's the difference between stealing, gazlan, and ganav? What's the difference between the two? Why is there a difference between the two? Why are we more strict with ganav rather than gazlan? And why do we pay 5 for the shiur and only 4 for the set? New Mishnah. Ein megadlin behema daka be'eretz Yisrael. Now this is something we already saw in Masechet Gitin. Okay, and actually, I see here, what does it say? It doesn't say Gitin, it says Ta'anit and Tmura. Okay, I remember learning this in Gitin also. I guess it just doesn't say so in the Masorah Shas. Good question. But anyway, Ein megadlin behema daka be'eretz Yisrael. You can't raise small animals in Israel. It's a little bit of a strange halacha. What, you can't have any small animals in Israel? It's a really good question, halacha l'maaseh, how this works. But yeah, the simple Mishnah says you can't. You can't raise these animals. What's the issue? Well, the issue is, number one, they're going to graze and eat the property and destroy Eretz Yisrael, which we don't want to allow. And number two, they're going to steal from other people. Now, even though you can compensate them if they eat other people's stuff, but still, we don't want you to damage things and then have to pay back for them. And Rashi points out 2 things. That is because of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and because most of the fields in Israel belong to Jews, which has to do more with the fact that you're ruining people's property, even if you're going to pay them back. What if it's only one? What if it's a Jewish area outside of Israel? What if it's an area in Israel, but it's not majority of Jews living there? So that's a good question and a big debate about how to understand Rashi. But in Syria, which was the part that David conquered, but already that was King David conquered it later. It wasn't the part of the actual borders of Israel, or midbarot shel Eretz Israel, or so places outside of Israel. Syria is just an example, but obviously beyond that also. And in the desert in Israel, where there is no real yishuv, first of all, we think of desert of just sand. In those days, desert was, and you can read up in Shuli Mishkan's article about the reality, as we call realia in those times, what was going on, and some stuff about sheep and chickens and things from our Mishna. So in flashback this week, it's all about that. But in Syria and the deserts in Israel, which really were places where the animals were supposed to graze, then you can do that. So if you're having your animals, you're breeding them outside the city or outside where people's fields are, then it's okay. You can't raise chickens in Jerusalem because of the Kodashim. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that they'll go into the garbage. They'll take out dead shratzim, dead creatures, which are tameh, and they might put them on sanctified stuff. And in Jerusalem, because you're right near the temple, there's a lot of things that are sanctified. Below Kohanim be'eretz Yisrael mipnei ta'arot, and not Kohanim in Israel because of ta'arot. Kohanim are, in other words, the Jews in Jerusalem are like Kohanim anywhere in Israel because they have all sorts of things that are held in sanctity, like their truma and other stuff, and therefore we don't want to mess up their stuff, so they can't raise chickens either. You can't raise pigs anywhere. Okay, is this just pigs? Is it kosher, all non-kosher animals? Is it for any reason? There's a whole debate about this whole thing. Maybe we'll get to it when we get to it in the Gemara. Don't raise dogs, unless you keep it on a leash, because dogs are dangerous. Don't put out traps for doves. You have to be a certain distance from a place where people are living, because otherwise you'll do bird calling and you'll catch other people's birds. The birds will fly to you and you'll end up stealing. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we start a Braita. That was the end of the Mishna, and a Braita which talks about similar things. Aval. So you can't breed small animals in Israel. But and this is how we find a heter, either the desert or in the forest, because in the forest you don't have other people's stuff that you're going to destroy. In Syria, even in settled land, and obviously you don't have to say anywhere beyond that. Another Braita, Taniida, in the desert in Judea you can, and on the border of Akko. If you remember, Akko was the city that was considered, you know where Akko is, right in the northern of Israel. It was considered a border city. We remember that from Gitin. Even though you can't have small animals, you can have large animals. Why is that? We can't do something that people can't handle. And if we wouldn't allow large animals, people would never have large animals to do the work for them in the fields. They wouldn't be able to stand up for them. They wouldn't be able to hold it. So we don't make gzerot. This is anyway gzerah. This is just so that we don't destroy Eretz Yisrael, but we don't make a gzerah, or we don't have you stealing in other people's lands, but we don't make a gzerah if the people can't manage it. It's too hard. That's a fascinating concept in and of itself. Now they're going to explain what's the difference between behemah dakah and behemah gasa. We also need behemot dakot. First of all, we need them for the shearing. We need them for slaughtering, right, for eating. So behemah dakah efshar lavi mechutz laaretz. If you need some, for whatever reason, you can bring them easily from outside of the land. First of all, they're easy to carry. They're easy to get around. Aval behemah gasa efshar lavi mechutz laaretz. But it's harder to bring big animals all the time. And first of all, it seems like, they're bigger. And I think it's more so that you need them much more often. You need more big animals because you use them for working. So there's a much greater need for them, and you're not going to be able to bring them all the time from outside the land. So therefore, we have to be more lenient in the behemah gasa than the behemah dakah, than the small animals. Now they start to make exceptions. Well, before the holidays, we allow you 30 days to have these animals because you need a lot of meat for the holidays. Or if you're making a wedding for your son, you're allowed to have it for 30 days before. But don't leave the last one. Like if you bought one, let's say 2 days before the holiday, you get 30 days, but you get 30 days from before the holiday. You don't get, if you didn't use it, let's say for the holiday, you don't get to keep it for 30 days, another 28 days after the holiday's over. You would have thought, you might have thought once the holiday is out, well, you get 30 days from when you bought it. Don't say you get 30 days from whenever. No, but since the regel was already done, we don't allow you to keep it. And with that, we finish the stuff. We'll get into more of these topics as we go on. Raising animals in Israel, what's allowed, what's not allowed, in what circumstances. That will be the topic for the next little while. Wishing everybody Shabbat Shalom and a Shavuot Tov.